Imagine Florida in 1901. Imagine a house placed in this earlier time, touching the edge of the New River on one side, keeping the Everglades at bay on the other. Secluded by today's standards, not yet dominated by concrete and glass, not yet overshadowed by civilization. A turn-of-the-century outpost servicing the scattered population of a fledgling Florida community. A house built on the edge of a swamp by a prominent but not wealthy man. A house built by Frank Stranahan for his wife, Ivy.
They were very close. She worshiped him, and I'm sure he worshiped Ivy.
She identified with that house. The house was a sense of place to her.
The Stranahan House is a tangible in the story of two pioneers who provided the foundations for the city of Fort Lauderdale. Frank, a man of commerce and business. Ivy, an activist, a humanitarian, a person of influence who fought for the people and the environment of her beloved Florida. August 6th, 1900. It was barely sunrise, certainly an unsuitable time for a wedding, but the train from Lemon City traveling north left at 6 a.m., and Frank Stranahan and Ivy Cromartie were anxious to begin their honeymoon. They journeyed to Asheville, Niagara Falls, and points north. Later, Ivy would comment that the excursion was exactly as Frank had promised. The two had met the year before, in 1899. Ivy Cromartie had traveled from Lemon City to the New River settlement to become its first school teacher. Newly certified, she was 18 years of age. She would later describe it as a perfectly wild community. There were only about 5 families and 9 pupils. Frank was 16 years her senior. Born in Ohio, he'd arrived in Melbourne, Florida in 1888, seeking opportunities. Florida was for many the new frontier.
And that opportunity was presented when Guy Metcalf opened the camp on the New River, the hack line that carried passengers from Lake Worth down to Lemon City.
On January 26, 1893, Frank arrived at the New River to run the overnight camp and ferry for the Lantana-Lemon City stage line. It was a lonely existence.
The fact that it was so isolated on the New River then, just literally a handful of white men lived and farmed in the vicinity or over at the House of Refuge, that it would take someone like Frank, who was a loner in many respects, to take the isolation of the New River in the 1893 period when he came down. So I think Frank was rather ideally suited by temperament and background.
In 1894, Mary Brickell, an early Florida landowner, requested that Frank move his original campsite 300 yards upriver. He complied, and in return, she deeded him 10 acres of land. It was here the Stranahan and Company trading post took shape, where Frank traded with the Seminoles, earned their respect, and established his exemplary reputation. Ivy had little contact with the Seminoles prior to moving to Fort Lauderdale. She became intrigued by the people and knew that it was essential for the children to be educated. As a married woman, she was no longer eligible to teach at the schoolhouse, so she taught the young Seminoles informally. Though the tribal elders didn't agree with the need for a white man's education, they didn't interfere.
Ivy wasn't trying to force non-native ways on the natives. She was just trying to establish a bridge and a dialogue so we could communicate with each other and learn about each other too, because in the end I always say the more we learn about each other, the more we realize we're all human beings.
In the years after their marriage, Frank established the first bank, acquired substantial land holdings, and held political office. Education, baseball, housing, a beachfront pavilion, anything Fort Lauderdale fell under his purview.
He was involved in virtually every promotion to expand the city and the New River area. A man who did not mind the solitude that he encountered when he came in 1893, and they're involved in these expansionist plans, real estate development. He was certainly a promoter of the drainage project, the North New River Canal that comes through there, the opening up of the Everglades of farmland. He was somewhat ambivalent on this, that certainly he would realize that more people would come in, and that would be good for business. At the same time, it would change the lifestyle that they'd known there.
Ivy's influence on her beloved husband became obvious when her social conscience crossed his business concerns. As a member of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, she had no truck with alcohol. Not only did she prevent Frank from selling liquor, but all other products containing alcohol, patent medicines, vanilla extract, nothing was too benign to be banned.
There was obviously a great deal of affection that they had for each other. And they tend to, over the years, because they were a childless couple, they weren't focused on raising a family, and they tended to kind of go down their own paths. And Frank continued in his business ventures, in which he was very successful. And Ivy goes out of the house in the sense of getting interested in a variety of civic affairs, and her work with the Indians, her work with the suffrage movement, and that sort of thing. So they seem to work out in a very fine relationship.
The role that the Stranahans played in the founding of Fort Lauderdale was profound but unassuming. They were reliable, visionary, and compassionate, never flamboyant or class-conscious, and their pragmatism was reflected in their home. The dwelling was as no-nonsense as its designer, Frank.
We believe that Frank was really the designer of this building, and he had been building other structures for the railroad and for the stage line and his own trading post. So we believe that really this was his own design.
Originally, the two-story vernacular structure was built as a mercantile. The main floor housed Frank's store. Here he conducted business with the Seminoles and a small community of settlers. The second story was accessed by an exterior staircase. The wide open space was used as a community center. Dances, church services, town meetings, the space was available for all.
I love the simplicity of the architecture. It was straightforward, it was unpretentious, and it worked. It worked as a very rugged trading post. It worked as a wonderful community center. And then within a 12-year period, it was completely modified to become this lovely, graceful residence.
Frank designed a building that could hold its own in the heavy heat and humidity, in the torrents of rain and hordes of insects.
This house is the perfect architectural invention for the day. It had a very steep roof that shed water beautifully in heavy rains. It had good deep porches that shaded the windows and allowed the cool interior to create a flow of air coming in at the ground floor, with the hot air rising and exiting out through the second floor windows and second floor. So you always had a movement of air through the building. And that was important in 1900, when this was in effect a jungle.
The wisdom of the overall design kept its inhabitants cool in the languid humidity of a tropical summer, and against all odds has allowed the building to survive more than a century of fire, hurricanes, and all the consequences of progress.
It was built in a very utilitarian way, and it was built to move in strong winds. This building has moved over time, and yet it stays on its foundation. And that's one of the beauties of these old wood frame houses. They actually move when high winds come along, and then as the winds subside, they kind of settle back to their original position. And that is why this house is still standing.
In 1904, Frank bought additional property from the Brickles and began plans to move his trading post to the thriving Fort Lauderdale business district.
That gave him the opportunity to move into this building as a residence. We think that the interior of this building, as you see it now, was put in at that time in 1906.
Today, the house is still fronted by the New River. Water courses against the concrete break wall that replaced the wooden steps in 1905. Gone are the elegant coconut palms and the surrounding acreage that allowed Frank and Ivy to indulge in their passion for gardening. Now the house is dwarfed by a city skyline, its image distorted in glass and steel. The 10 acres that Frank was given in 1894 has been pared down to a mere 3/4 of an acre. So little remains. 2 royal palm trees on the west property line and a live oak that Frank and Ivy planted together in 1901 still survive. And of course, the house. It has been painstakingly, lovingly restored to its 1913 likeness. The house is furnished with antiques from the period, but few were actually used by Frank and Ivy. Such is the case in the kitchen, a warm, vibrant representation of the period. As you enter the dining room, a set of Bavarian fish dishes are displayed above the door, a wedding gift from wealthy railroad baron Henry Flagler. The table is set with a blue willow dinner service. While not the original, it replaces a set Ivy had ordered from Sears, Roebuck & Company. A graceful oak curved glass front china cabinet presides in the dining room. It rests comfortably against the warmth of the beautiful, indestructible Dade County pine. This wood covers the walls and ceilings throughout the house. It was used because of its availability, but the effect is striking. In the china cabinet is Ivy's chocolate service. Though she would never imbibe caffeine or alcohol, she had a decided weakness for hot chocolate. With the construction of US 1, the main entrance to the house shifted from the New River to the eastern porch. By 1913, guests would have been welcomed through these French doors.
Originally, all of the traffic was along the New River, and the house was oriented to that traffic. But when the cars and when the traffic came along US 1, they actually changed the orientation of the house to the east.
The old trading post safe is hunkered down under the staircase that was added in 1913 to give access to the second floor. The office houses an array of artifacts from another time: sacks of flour, colorful native dress, a lion head stamp. One can almost picture Frank seated at his desk calculating the day's receipts. He most probably used the barrister's oak bookcase and the white china spittoon. His oak table chair sits by the bay window. There are 2 such bay windows flanking the original main entrance. These were added during the 1906 conversion. They helped distinguish the building as a home instead of a commercial property. 2 charming hand-painted lampshades hang in the downstairs parlors. One can envision Ivy and Frank seated in front of the distinctively patterned brick fireplace. Perhaps they listened to music, or read, or simply shared the day's events. The deer head that hangs above it isn't the one that held such vivid memories for Ivy's niece, Alice Cromartie Stafford.
My most outstanding memory as a 3-year-old is being rubbed with camphorated oil. It's cool, chilly winter. Fire in the fireplace. We're sitting here. I'm getting rubbed, and we're doing a Bible study story. And then she sends me alone upstairs to bed. So when I get to that landing, she always says, "Good night, Alice." And I want to look at her. She's speaking, so I want to look at her, but that deer is looking at me. So I would say, "Good night, Aunt Ivy." I never want to look at that deer. So, you know, it frightened me to be going up by myself.
Upstairs in a small bedroom is a well-worn white sewing machine. It's positioned with a view of the river, a view of which Ivy never tired. She preferred to make her own dresses, and somewhat surprisingly, was quite fashion conscious. In the master bedroom, a black lace blouse reclines on the bed, a lone black cotton stocking, diminutive high-button shoes, all Ivy's. Frank's spats keep company with his wife's belongings. In 1926, the Florida land boom collapsed, aided in part by a horrific hurricane. Another storm in 1928 drove Fort Lauderdale's economy into a depression. Frank's considerable land holdings, which were also heavily mortgaged, left him in mounting debt. Financially and physically exhausted, Frank reached a low point in 1929. In April, he would write in his diary, "My wife gave me much encouragement, but I can't seem to grasp it." In May, Frank had a nervous breakdown and spent 10 days in the hospital. After he was released, Ivy had been admonished not to leave him alone. But on May 22, 1929, they returned from an excursion. Ivy stepped into the house for just 10 minutes. Only 10 minutes, but that was time enough.
Uncle Frank had committed suicide in the river in front of the house. And when the funeral service was over, which was here at the house, out on the riverfront, right where he put himself overboard with the sewer grate tied to his waist, my family decided that Ivy could not be left alone. She needed someone.
And that someone was 3-year-old Alice. As a child, she was curious about this woman who practiced yoga and proclaimed herself a vegetarian, who was equally vocal in her opposition to drinking and her support of suffrage.
She did yoga. She was ahead of her time. She did all of these exercises, and she would come and do them in the bedroom, me in the bed, and I can remember laughing till my sides hurt. My mother never got on the floor, and she probably was too tired to get on the floor. But Aunt Ivy would come and do all of her exercises, bending, stretching, bending over. She was double jointed, I think, because she could spread her legs out like this and put her nose on the carpet, just clear down. She really was a very limber, lithe little lady.
After Frank's death, Ivy was tossed unexpectedly into the world of real estate, finance, and investment.
She was quite unaware of his business holdings, and that would be a difficult thing for anyone to face. Obviously, your husband has just died quite unexpectedly, a very shocking death, and now suddenly you have to try and rebuild his holdings in terms of, or find out what they are, first of all, to see what shape they're in. And you put that in the context of what was happening in the Florida economy in 1929 and the collapse of the land boom. So she had a very difficult task, and if it had not been out of the kindness of the heart of the woman who held the mortgage on the house, she would have lost the house as well.
Though she ultimately lost much of Frank's property, she refused to give up her house, her homestead. She seemed to understand that it was more than a trading post or a residence. It had been the town center.
This house was not only her home, but it was really the bedrock of the community. This is where she taught school. This is where the post office was. This is where people came to sell their wares and buy other wares and bring the news of the day and share the news with the other settlers. I think Mrs. Stranahan knew that this was a special place in this area, and it was important to her to stay here.
Frank's death, his suicide, was an incredible blow to Ivy. She wore black, not for a year as was the custom, but for more than 10 years. She had an iron will, and once she was able, she re-entered the fray, determined to make Fort Lauderdale a community to be proud of. She let rooms to tourists. She rented the ground floor to a restaurateur. She invested, and over time, her prudence paid off. Her goal was not survival, but a continuation of the work she and Frank had begun. She collected her meager rents and then gave them to just causes, personal and civic. During the Great Depression, Ivy watched as non-payment of taxes resulted in foreclosures. Homes were literally being lost on the courthouse steps. She and her supporters started a movement that resulted in Florida's homestead exemption law. In the mid-1930s, Ivy turned her energies toward establishing a hospital for the Black community. She championed such diverse concerns as family planning and the Campfire Girls, housing for the elderly, and the Garden Club. Ivy's interests, her causes and concerns seemed to be limitless. If it needed to be done, she would see that it was. Ivy began advocating on behalf of the Seminole tribe from her first days on the New River, and she never stopped. She fought for land, education, health care, and dignity, all of which she felt the tribe was entitled to.
She didn't care the color of your skin. She didn't care who you prayed to, but she cared about you as a human being.
In the end, she may have slowed her pace, but she never stopped. Ivy died in the house on August 30th, 1971. The property was gifted to the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Some years later, it was purchased by the Fort Lauderdale Historical Society, a purchase made possible in part with money that had been donated by Ivy.
And I think she saw the house as an important part of that legacy of being pioneers. And fortunately for us, she held on to it.
Frank and Ivy Stranahan were frontiers people, and they were tough, they were generous. That is what this community, what the city of Fort Lauderdale is founded on.
Because in Native culture and philosophy, your wealth is not measured by what you accumulate, but what you share.
This program was made possible with support from Wayne and Marty Huizinga and by
over 30 undergraduate degrees, a 300-acre Fort Lauderdale Davie campus, and the experience of a lifetime. Nova Southeastern University. Your future, your terms.
AT&T is proud to help strengthen the communities we serve by investing in public television. This program on the Stranahan House preserves our shared history and underscores the value of preservation.
The Wachovia Wells Fargo Foundation, committed to building strong and vibrant communities, improving the quality of life, and making a positive difference. And Allison Joseph Smith. Additional support was provided by Connie and Theo Foltz and Trip Scott, PA.